Welcome to the Brand Together podcast. Join host Brett Ryan to dive deep and go behind the scenes of successful brand partnerships. Featuring pros from every industry and vertical, from mega brands to startups and everything in between. The Brand Together podcast is essential listening for anyone interested in learning more about brand partnerships. Are you ready? Let's dive in.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Brand Together podcast. I'm your host, Brett Ryan. I'm joined today by Sam Cohen, a VP of Strategy and Business Development at Retail Voodoo, which is a boutique consumer goods strategy firm which provides insights, strategy, and design with a focus on better-for-you brands. Sam, welcome to the podcast. It's a pleasure to have you. I've been excited. I've wanted you on this podcast for a little while now, and I'll tell you why in just a second, but welcome to the podcast. Could you just say hi to our audience and give yourself a little more of an introduction?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks much, Brett. It's a pleasure to join you today. We've been in touch for, I think, a couple of years now over different social media, phone calls, and things like that. And it's developed into a really rewarding conversation. I love just chatting with other folks in consumables, other folks in marketing, and just germinating more ideas. So I appreciate the opportunity to chat with you today. I recently joined Retail Voodoo in a consulting role. Prior to this, I spent about 20 years in different marketing and sales roles for a few different consumer goods companies. Folks might know Foster Farms and Darigold, where I spent different long stretches of my career. Also ran sales and marketing at a smaller pet products company called Healthy Pet. And over the course of that time, a lot of my work has been what I would call economic inspired or connected with the macro environment. A lot of what I think about is how CPG companies can operate more like companies from other industries, or how CPG companies can really leverage the headwinds or tailwinds that are in the macro economy to better meet consumer needs.
I love that. And when I think back, I've spent my career in software, but when I think about some of the home runs that the marketing teams I've been on have hit, they've almost always been at the tailwinds of a trend that we've understood. And I think doing that kind of analysis and presenting it consistently. So by the way, I'm going to digress here for just a minute and just say, if you're not following Sam Cohen on LinkedIn, please do. It's part of the reason that I was so excited to have you on the show because, and I've told you this before, and I'm not just blowing smoke at you, the rapidity and consistency with which you post incredible retail and CPG insights on LinkedIn, it's just like a smorgasbord of great, crunchy, valuable information. I've got a story I want to share with you, and then we can hop into the interview. It's funny, the other day you posted this great, insightful article and some of your own thoughts about, it was essentially about the future of convenience stores attached to gas stations. And funnily enough, this is a funny personal story, is that I was actually looking into purchasing a gas station a short time ago, and had this cool owner financing deal and had the paperwork drawn up and everything. And I just arrived at the conclusion that I wasn't going to do it. And maybe it was a little confirmation bias or whatever, but I saw that analysis and I'm just like, wow, I wish I would have had this a little sooner. It might have made my decision-making process easier. But my perception is those insights are just so broadly valuable. And for me, at least in my corner of the world, I don't see that a lot. And so to have someone like you in my social media feed really breaking it down and having a well-informed, I would say hyper-competent viewpoint on some of those things is a blessing. And so thank you for that. And if you listen to the podcast and you're interested in those kind of analytical insights, I'd encourage you, just follow Sam Cohen. He's posts good stuff every day, some of the best stuff I see on my feed. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thanks much. I appreciate the kind word, Brett. I've gotten a lot of positive feedback over the years from people about the stuff that I post on LinkedIn. The community that's on there is, in my mind, it's a little bit of a nicer version of Twitter or X, right? Where Twitter, X, you get a lot of people who are providing value, who are posting things that have I'll call it deep expertise, interesting insights, offbeat data, and things like that. But the tone can be a little sharp, right? It doesn't bother me, but the exchanges go pretty quickly, and it has a little bit of a sharp culture over there on Twitter X. The thing about LinkedIn is some people think of it as maybe a little bit cringe. It's a lot of that kind of hustle, grind set kind of mentality, but it's a more optimistic group, and
Definitely.
it's a little bit of a more supportive environment. And I would tell you a lot of the stuff I post is really just intended to capture, I'll call it the depth, quality of what you'd see on X, but move it over to, I'll call it a more positive and non-political environment. You'll notice I post only about economics, never about politics. And that's by design, because I think we're trying to elevate the conversation a little bit. And that's ties in with my background that you asked about, Brett. Part of it is I started out as someone really interested in economics and really interested in business coming from more of an economic angle. And the thing about brand management is, in a lot of ways, as a career, applied economics. If you think of engineering as applied science, being the leader of a brand as a brand manager, or the driver of a brand as a brand manager, is like applied economics in a way. People think of marketing as being things like advertising, public relations, consumer promotions, and things like that. And that's obviously a big part of it. But really, brand managers are looking at all of the different economic levers they can pull, whether it be innovation, cost out, pricing, growth, all of the above. And so, coming from an economics background, I got really interested in marketing through brand management, more of a general management mentality versus, let's say, call it the pure advertising kind of stuff that people think of when they think of marketing. So it's always been interesting and fun for me.
No, and I love that too. And I know we've got young listeners on the podcast, and it's always interesting to understand how marketing professionals find their way into that career path. And I'll tell you, I entered marketing via politics. I worked for a senator prior to getting into marketing, and I was surprised at how useful my education was. And people hear politics and marketing, and sometimes they draw this cross section of negative ideas there. But really, it's similar in the sense I see the applied economics angle, particularly when it comes to strategy and long term thinking for the health and benefit of a firm, right? Setting yourself against macro headwinds and things like that. And I see the value there. So thank you for that. I want to hop into the meat of our conversation today. As this is the Brand Together podcast, I have a couple questions for you that I'm excited to dig into, really around brand partnerships. We have a lot of listeners who aspire to brand partnerships, who are maybe managing brand partners. Every year, we always do, but this Super Bowl was no different, where we saw plenty of brand partnerships, plenty of big name celebrities aligning themselves with large brands. There's a lot of meat we could dig into there, but I want to focus on a different question set. And I'll just kick this off again by hailing back to some of the great insights I read from you on LinkedIn. Some time ago, this was months ago, I think, I read a post that you made about Crumble cookies. I guess they're Crumble now. They used originally Crumble cookies. Now the brand is called Crumble. And they were at the time, I think they might still be, they were engaging in a couple of brand partnerships that, in my perception, this is my opinion, right, with a lowercase o, but my perception is that they were participating in a couple of brand partnerships that to me didn't necessarily strike me as intuitive. And I'd been thinking about it. In fact, we discussed it on the podcast with another one of my guests. And I saw you made an observation. And the essence of that I'm paraphrasing you, but the essence of your observation is that sometimes brand partnerships can indicate that a particular product or a particular brand has moved past the apex of its growth. And now it's looking to partner with other brands in different product categories as a means of jump-starting growth in a different product category, or accelerating brand permission in like an adjacent product category. And I would love it if you could just elaborate on that observation, clarify a little bit. I just want to hear more of your thinking on brand partnerships and what they signal to you about a brand and its growth trajectory?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's a good question. And I'll emphasize I'll call it sometimes part of my answer.
Yeah.
What I would say is rising brands, emerging or high growth brands can benefit from partnerships. Certainly, depending upon the brand, it may be a good fit. I tend to think of them as more of a tool for, I'll call it a mature brand. Doesn't mean that it's a tool for declining brands so much as just a more mature brand. And the reason I say that is if you're an emerging brand, if you're a high growth brand, you're growing way faster than your category. You've got a lot of trial to drive. You've got, in the case of someone like Crumble, you've got new locations or something like that you can do. It's really, for me, partnerships could be a little bit of a distraction that adds some complexity, right? When you're a young brand, there's a lot of potential in growing what you do today. You could just do more of the same, and there's a lot of potential to that.
Mm-hmm.
And when you do a partnership, if the other brand has a strong brand of their own, then it can blur your brand a little bit, right?
Yeah.
From that standpoint, or it adds some complexity, right? And so what I would suggest is that when you're a young brand, a growing brand, you've got a lot of growth potential, but your brand isn't really cemented in the mind of the consumer.
Yeah.
You don't have high awareness. You don't have really strong equity yet. It doesn't mean that your brand isn't good, but it's maturing, right? It's a teenager, if you will.
Yep.
And for you to then bring in a partnership, that adds complexity, and it can just make it harder to keep your brand sharp and pure. There's a little bit of I'll call it tension there that maybe isn't a great bet for a growing brand. Whereas for a mature brand, it's the opposite. For a mature brand, your brand is really well known. Your brand is really well understood by the consumer. Your brand is sharp and firm. You've got a lot of equity, but you don't have as much headroom to grow. And you've got to start finding adjacent growth opportunities like you mentioned. And that's where a partnership might make sense. It's just that trade-off of what do you have to gain versus what do you have to lose for a growing brand, a smaller brand versus a larger, more mature, but potentially slower growing brand.
Definitely. And I love the word you use about complexity, how it introduced complexity. Mm-hmm. You know what it reminds me of? So I mentioned at the top of our podcast, and listeners don't know, I've spent most of my career in software as a service. And there have been a few times where I've been at companies that have produced a product for a particular audience, say universities, right? Departments at universities. And just as sure as the sun rises and sets, this conversation would come up occasionally of, hey, do we go after K through 12? Do we go after government? Do we go after any one of these adjacent audiences? And the conversation already ensues. We would have to introduce so much complexity into our product. We'd have to change so many things. And why would we do that when there's still so much opportunity in the audience that we're laser focused on right now, right? And I think it's a similar conversation. It's a flavor of the idea you just articulated. And I think, to me, one of those key takeaways for a young and immature brand is like, get really laser focused on one thing, right? Don't go do cereal or soap or something if you want to be the cookie brand, right? And that's the thing you want to be. And once again, I don't want to pick on Crumble. They're just an example, right? But I love that insight.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think maybe one way to think of it would be, one, it's just about resource allocation. When you're a growing company, you have to be really careful how you use your ammunition. And whether you're a one-person company or even $100 million a year company, $200 million a year company, you have to be really careful how you use your ammunition. And from that standpoint, you want to make sure you're allocating your resources to the, call it, highest value task. And I think that's where the complexity argument comes in. You pay a lot of complexity tax. I think the other piece of it would be, and this was part of what drove my note about Crumble, was whether you're moving from, I'll call it, a higher value experience to a lower value experience or the other way around, right? A trip to a restaurant, as an example, is a high value experience. It's expensive, right? Even if you just go to Chipotle by yourself, it's $15 or $20 if you live in Seattle.
Yep.
It's a high value experience versus if I buy a box of cereal in a grocery store, That's a $3, $4, $5 purchase. So it's a lower value experience. And so I always get concerned when I see brands that aren't mature expanding down,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
Because you're lowering yourself in the mind of the consumer. You're undermining the economics of your, I'll call it, higher value offering. So if I can get access to a brand in a cheaper environment, consumers will.
Yep. Yep.
And doing that, I think when you're a young brand is risky from that standpoint. And I think that in other spaces where really mature, really high equity brands in fashion and beauty and spaces like that, they democratize down. They add diffusion lines, they enter cheaper price point categories, whether it be streetwear, fragrances, things like that. They're doing that as a mature brand, right? They're doing that because they built up really good awareness, really good equity. They have a strong business, but growth is slowing and they need to make their brand available to more consumers. And in that case, they are, I'll call it, moving to a lower value offering. They're adding a secondary offering that's of less value, but they're at a point where that trade-off of growth is better for them, right? Versus if you're a company that's in, or a brand that's in a high value space and you still have a lot of room to run, you should be very careful about all of a sudden introducing a lower value offering, right? Starbucks, great example of that, where they entered CPG and they have Starbucks coffee, obviously in grocery stores and all of the beverages and Frappuccino and whatnot. They did that after there were already 5,000 Starbucks open. They did that after there were already 7,000 Starbucks open. So their, I'll call it, high value offering, the cafe experience of Starbucks, was already built out and starting to slow, not shrink, but was maturing. And then adding bolt-on growth with some lower value experiences in the form of Frappuccino or other licensing of the CPG stuff was a good way to keep growing as a brand, extend what they're doing. That's where those sorts of things make sense. And that's where a partnership would make sense. But if Starbucks was doing that when there was only 250 cafes, that might not have been a good use of time, right?
Yeah.
Good use of money. And I think that was how I was looking at it for Crumble, is this is as if Starbucks launched this packaged coffee in stores when there were only 250 cafes.
Definitely. Yeah, I totally agree with you. I love the thought of interpreting it as a resource allocation problem, right? Which it totally is. Your example prompts another thought that I want to get your take on. You mentioned seeing Starbucks in the grocery store now, and they've got take home consumer packaged product there. Nowadays, 20 years ago, when I went to the grocery store, I felt like seeing a quick service brand or a fast casual brand in the grocery store aisle, it felt really rare. In fact, I feel like I hardly saw it all. And in the space of 15 or 20 years, you walk down the coffee creamer section today, right? Walk down the cereal aisle today, right? And it seems like more and more brands, big brands, maybe you describe them as blue chip brands, are partnering to get themselves in grocers. And to me, that's indicative of what is possibly a larger trend, where it seems like more and more CPG brands are participating in brand partnerships today than they were 10, 15, 20 years ago. And that's anecdotal. I don't have any data to back that idea up, but do you agree that the proliferation of brand partnerships seems to be increasing? And then my follow-up would be, what might be driving the trend one way or another?
Yeah, and I think I agree. Also, no data, right? So speculative on my part as well, but it does certainly seem like there are more of these partnerships, whether they be licenses or JVs, co-brands, or just LTOs or different things. It certainly seems like there's more of them than 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. I think a lot of it may be social media driven, right? Where the social media, the kind of a double-edged sword where for brands, where I'll call it the kind of viral aspects of it, the kind of free media, but then also the ability to combine free media and paid media very well, getting the earned and the paid to work together really well is
Yep.
unique to social. We didn't have that before. And the dynamism of it, just the speed of it, is amazing compared to the media of 15 or 20 years ago. And so I think social media, I think is driving some of it because there's an opportunity with these different partnerships to leverage that heat and at least recapture some level of virality
Yep.
as well. I think the other part of it, honestly, from a CPG perspective, is that private label keeps getting better and better. Some of what you're seeing is that essentially it takes more to justify a brand premium at all than
Yeah.
it did 10 or 20 years ago.
Yep.
The retailers have done a great job with private label. They continue to do a great job. And I also think it's that the internet is powering better and more efficient sourcing, faster development and things like that. So a lot of the kind of coordination of private label has gotten, I'll call it, easier and better.
Yep.
And in an environment where the consumer has private label choices that are pretty compelling, they meet the needs, they have quality, they have the sort of same features and benefits as a lot of mid-tier products. Brands have to layer on more emotion
Yep.
to survive. Brands need to climb up higher in order to survive. It's a little bit of a kind of an up or out thing for brands versus private label as private label improves. And I think partnerships are one way you do that, especially if you're a mature brand.
Definitely. It's interesting because the very definition of the white label slash, I agree with you, by the way, there's some Kirkland signature, right? I love that
Yeah,
stuff.
for sure.
Definitely above the 500 mark, I would argue, for quality in most cases. I'm digressing, but it's interesting from the perspective of marketing strategy because the very definition of private label or white labeled products is they're not making an investment in the brand, right? They're relying on, in the brand in and of itself as its own entity, right?
Mhm.
It's if we know that, I'll just go back to Kirkland Signature. If we know the house brand isn't trying to go viral on social media, isn't necessarily trying to develop that emotional connection or play with consumers, there's a field that we can play in that we know they're at least not going to try and compete with us in that dimension, right? And if we can
Mhm.
hit a couple home runs or even hit a couple singles or doubles as far as driving trials or some kind of incremental channel growth through social media, I can see how that suddenly becomes a pretty important part of your overall marketing strategy, right? So I love
Yeah.
that insight.
Yeah, for sure. I think a lot of it is honestly, it's channel strategy where the role that the brands play for the retailer has evolved over time. And in a lot of spaces, the branded players, the big branded players might have played the role of meeting most consumers' needs, right? So
Mhm.
most consumers would have had needs for certain functionality, certain performance, quality, trust. I'll call it the baseline, pretty good for most people offering. And I think you're right. When I look at Kirkland Signature or I look at what Kroger's done with their Simple Truth products, or a lot of, certainly 365 fits into this, where the retailer has enough trust with the shopper that they play that role.
Yep.
And so brands really need to play a different role for the retailer. And I do think partnerships are a way to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you for sharing that. I have I wanted to ask this question earlier in our conversation, and then I got onto the idea of seeing more brands in grocery stores. But earlier, just to back us up a little bit, we were talking about the maturity of brands and how a brand might evaluate the decision to partner, whether it's entering a new product category or not, with another brand. My question to you is, in your experience, do you think that is there a heuristic that a brand might use? How would you broadly think about, is our brand ready for partnerships, right? If I were to hypothetically hand you, I'm not even going to give you a hypothetical. I'm just going to ask broadly, are there any easy heuristics where, say, a brand is maturing, maybe they've got great awareness in their particular product category, but maybe they're unknown outside of that, right? I don't know. Think of whatever hypotheticals you can. I'm just wondering broadly, if I'm
Mm.
running a small brand, small shop, what are some of the telltale signs that might suggest to you our brand is ready to start seriously thinking about engaging in brand partnerships?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I might think of it, one is there's no one right time, right? So just to my sort of almost a little bit jokey answer would be to say you get married when you find the right person,
Yeah.
not because you're the right age to get married, right?
Yep. Yep.
Might just be a little bit of a jokey answer, but to be serious about it, I think partnerships from a timing standpoint, it's really whether there's something you can do, a partnership you can execute that's highly incremental, but likely not strategic. Because if something is strategic, if something is, I'll call it crucial in your category or crucial in your brand,
Yeah.
then it's probably something you need to be figuring out how to do.
Yeah.
Now, a partnership might be a way to step into that or enter safely, but
Yep.
I'll use the example of ice cream, let's say, that would be a good one. The second most common flavor of ice cream is chocolate. If I were a brand and I thought to myself, gosh, I'm going to do a co-branded ice cream with a chocolate company, I think my question would be, are you going to do that forever?
Yep.
Is that something you're doing forever? Because chocolate is the number 2 flavor. You really need consumers to like your brand in chocolate. You really can't
Yep.
probably make that dependent upon someone else's brand. It might be a way of looking at it versus if you said, hey, I'm an ice cream brand and I'm growing rapidly. Ice cream sales are slow in January. I am going to partner with someone who sells, I don't know what, something for Lunar New Year. And we're going to produce a special Lunar New Year ice cream LTO.
Yep.
And I'm an ice cream brand and they're whatever, a restaurant or a clothing brand or something that has some relevance with Lunar New Year, then that's a great opportunity for a partnership, right? Because you do something that's incremental during a slow time of
Yep.
year and it's non-strategic, right?
Yep.
Lunar New Year is not a key part of the ice cream business. And that's one where you could really gain an edge versus your competitors by being a brand that was the ice cream of Lunar New Year is an offbeat thing, right?
Yep.
So I think when you say what's the right timing for partnerships, I think the answer is when the right window comes along,
Yep.
where it's something that's incremental, but probably non-strategic. Because if it's something strategic, it's probably almost something you have to figure out on your own.
I love that. I love that frame of reference, and I agree with you. And I think it almost frames it as almost like a risk management thing, right? Where it's like, how much business do we want to build on the back of the strategic value that a partner contributes, right?
Mhm.
Rather than like a tactical opportunity. And I love framing it that way. And you know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of, so I've got a friend who owns a small business, small brand, and he has built almost his entire customer audience on TikTok. And about a month ago, that was looking
Mhm.
really risky for a second. And it's that the idea of if you develop a certain strength in multiple marketing channels, you de-risk against any one marketing channel going sideways, right? And it reminds me somewhat of that, right? I think at least one of the principles behind the idea is let's not take on an inordinate amount of risk by relying on the strategic value that a partnership provides. And I love that because you could really back yourself into a corner if you do that. And I think that's a great guiding idea. Here's one. This is a selfish question, but I love asking it. And I'm really curious to hear your answer too. Do you have any favorite brand partnerships? Like just as a consumer, obviously I want to hear your expert insights too, but just when you walk down the grocery aisle or when you're doing shopping for
Mhm.
whatever it is you purchase in the Cohen home, are
Mhm.
there any brand partnerships that just smack you and say, man, this is great, or I really like what they're doing?
Yeah, thanks for the question. We're all marketers, the consumers, right? And so it's an interesting space to be in. I'll maybe do some that I don't love
Yeah.
and some that I do. One I am puzzled by, and you saw us advertising on this over the past week has been really heavy as we've gotten into the new year and stuff, is some of the stuff that's going on in the personal care
Yeah.
aisle is really puzzling to me. Like Native had this partnership with Harito Soda and Dunkin' Donuts. And that one's really hard to grasp
Yep.
for me, where Native is a kind of upscale brand, top of the category pricing. You look at the packaging is very, call it science oriented, all white, very clean, Apple Store vibes and sans serif fonts and whatnot. The look of Native and the price point and the fact that it's quote unquote natural, they have a very kind of serious, kind of modern aesthetic. And so it's difficult to see how that fits with soda
Yeah.
scented body wash or donut scented.
Yeah.
And there's a little bit of an oddity. I don't think of clean and food as necessarily going together, right? Clean and hygiene
Yep.
versus sugary, sticky foods. And so that one is a little bit odd to me. Doritos and Dunkin' are fun, accessible, everyman type brands. Nothing against them. They're winners in their spaces. They're great
Yep.
brands,
Yep.
but they just have a very different positioning than Native. And so I wonder about whether that's really making sense. And Native is a P&G brand, right? They've
Yep.
got tons of research. They're really sharp people, obviously. But what I wonder about is I don't get that somebody who pays $14 for deodorant is excited about the deodorant that smells like donuts or soda.
Yeah.
And I don't think the person that loves the Ben Affleck Dunkin' Donuts commercial during the Super Bowl is necessarily the person who's, oh, I need the $14 natural deodorant, right?
Yep. Yep.
I'm
Yep.
struggling with how those two go together. So that'd be one that I would throw out as not making sense.
Yep.
In terms of one that I really love is what Mondelez has done with Oreo.
Okay.
They have done an absolutely amazing job with partnerships.
Yeah.
And their partners really vary. They've done one with Coca-Cola. They've done obviously a Post Malone signature one. So they have all those LTOs.
Yep.
And that's a great example of kind of what we were talking about earlier, where private label can make me a sandwich cookie.
Yep.
Right? Kirkland Signature could make me a cookie that's as good as an Oreo, right? If Oreo has a reason for being, it's going to have to be more emotional. It's going to have to be about the brand, right? Those are not cookies that are going to make me run faster. And they taste great. They're great. Private label could probably make a cookie that tastes pretty good too. It's really about the brand at that point. I think Mondelez has done a great job just embracing that and doubling down on that with Oreo, where they're bringing energy, they're bringing fun, they're bringing excitement to what could be a boring space, let's say.
Yep.
And they're doing something for both the retailer and the consumer that's super unique that no smaller brand could do and no private label could do. So I would say they're one that I'm always curious to see which one's next.
Yeah.
Because they've done a great job keeping it going and really making it part of their brand in a strategic way.
Yeah. And that also goes back to something that you mentioned earlier that we were discussing, which is the phrase you used that I really liked is, are we going to do this forever? And does Oreo do these brand partnerships forever? I don't know, but they've certainly made a long-term commitment and they've really made it a part of their strategy. And I think that's part of the reason the sum is greater than its parts in this case, so I've got a friend on social media who buys every single new Oreo flavor. It's Swedish Fish. Oh, it's Coca-Cola. Oh, and they just can't wait to try them and review them. And you know what? Some of them are great and some of them he doesn't like as much, but just the fact that Oreo is experimenting with all these new flavors makes their target audience at those kind of partnerships delights. It makes them much more forgiving when one doesn't go well. And it probably skews the net impact of those partnership initiatives to the positive. And there's, I can think of a couple of brands who, going back to the distinction we were discussing earlier, they really made that decision to make it a part of their larger long-term strategy. Oreo is a good example. I would argue Coca-Cola is getting into a little bit more, but you could even go look at a brand like Lego, right? Where it's like every intellectual property from Star Wars to Harry Potter to Manchester United exists in a Lego set, right? And they've really made it a part of their product strategy, their innovation strategy, these partnerships, right? And so I agree with that observation. I just wanted to mention that I do think when you make that big strategic commitment and really invest, that it becomes a legitimate growth vector for them at a certain threshold.
For sure. I think it's interesting you bring up Coke. I almost think that Oreo and Coke are a great comparison of where it works and maybe where it doesn't to some
Yeah.
extent. Oreo, what I would say is it's really, they have an LTO strategy. Really, they've determined that LTOs are a big part of their business
Mhm.
and a big part of their brand, right?
Mhm.
That
Mhm.
that a big part of their brand is fun, is new, is casual, is experimental, right? That their brand is not just taste, it's amusement in a
Yeah.
way, right?
Yep.
It leveled up even beyond taste into amusement in a way. And the LTOs are part of that. And they've done dozens of these LTOs that weren't partnerships, that weren't co-brands, right? They had
Mhm.
the unicorn ones and birthday cake and all these other different ones. And they obviously do the seasonal one. There's Valentine's ones out in stores right now and holiday flavors and whatnot. And so then when they started to come with the Peeps and the Coca-Cola and the Post Malone, that was a way of really turbocharging an existing strategic plank of their brand.
Yeah.
And the consumer and the retailer were shown those in a larger context where they make sense. That a brand that is casual, a brand that is fun and loose and amusing, not just taste, but a particular personality that really suits that, it makes sense for all these things. And the fact that some of them don't go great, the fact that some of them aren't loved by everyone, actually is on brand for them and it's all good, right? Versus, let's say, Coca-Cola, where Coca-Cola is really trust and quality. It's Americana, right?
Yep.
Coca-Cola is like the flag,
Yep.
right? And it's, you don't mess with the flag that much. And you've seen they've tried to do LTOs and some of them work, some of them don't. People's expectations for them are so high. If a Coca-Cola line extension, if a new flavor of Coke is not liked by 80, 90% of the people, it's considered a failure.
Yep.
And if it doesn't last for years, it's considered a failure because their brand, while it's maybe lives in some similar emotional spaces to Oreo in terms of taste and experience and heritage and memory of childhood and things like that, but it's much more serious. It's much more like a cultural pillar versus being a source of amusement. And it's that sort of seriousness about the Coca-Cola brand that I think defends the business, right? It makes the business very sturdy and the business is held up really well. But if you look at what's worked for them is Coke Zero. What's worked for them is change the experience as little as possible while better meeting my emerging nutritional preferences, or some modern trends meet those a little bit better with smaller cans or bigger cans or what have you, right? Coca-Cola and Mondelez, they both have these really low variable costs, right? Oreo and Coca-Cola cans are both shelf stable, super cheap to make, big factories, massive distribution infrastructure,
Yep.
great executing teams, but one brand, because that brand is really about amusement, let's say, has a very different relationship and a very different context for partnerships, collaborations, LTOs, and things like that,
Yep.
where it's on brand for them. Whereas with Coca-Cola, that's just not how you see them, right?
Mhm.
They're
Mhm.
fantastic. They're amazing. They have amazing equity. They really are like the flag, so to speak. But the same way, you don't want to fool with the flag a lot.
Yep.
You don't want to fool with Coca-Cola a lot.
Yep.
It's what's the minimum amount of change possible to stay acceptable, versus Oreo has made their brand about change, has made their brand about new in a different way. And so while they might be in the same family for consumers, they're cousins, not brothers. And I think when you say, when is it right to do a partnership, or a lot of the things you've asked about or that you think about, if people are trying to figure out when is it right to do a partnership, I think one way to think about it would be, does this partnership suit my brand? Post Malone and Oreo go together, right? Or another way to look at it is just Oreo and Coca-Cola. a Coca-Cola flavored Oreo feels more right to me than Oreo flavored Coca-Cola.
Definitely.
Might be
Definitely.
a way of thinking of it. And that's, I think, a good thing for consumers to ask them. You mentioned Lego. Lego obviously is amazing at this,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
Lego is second to none. You asked about collaborations that I personally, I wouldn't call it, really amused by some of the Legos that call out to things that are design icons, right?
Yeah.
Lego in a lot of ways is a children's toy, but it's something that a lot of adults who are design oriented or design minded appreciate it, right? So I love that there's a Lego Vespa.
Yep.
I
Yep.
love that there's a Lego Frank Lloyd Wright house. And I think that's a really good example of where it's non-strategic, but highly incremental. If you're the estate of Frank Lloyd Wright, being in the toy business is non-strategic for you.
Pretty.
Partnering with Lego is highly incremental. If you're Lego, you are not going to get into the scooter business or the car business or the architecture business or whatever it is. And so having the Lego McLaren or the Lego Frank Lloyd Wright house, the Lego Eiffel Tower, what have you, all of those things are fun and they're incremental. They move you to a higher experience, a higher value experience. Those are expensive sets bought more by adults, right?
Yep.
So it's high incrementality and it's moving you to a higher value position space, but it's non-strategic, right? The core of the business is still kids, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And similarly, Lego, they're not going to get into sci-fi movie production or video games, right? And actually, they've done a lot of video games via partnerships. But thank you for highlighting that, because that you're bringing up an important nuance where I would argue that Lego has made a strategic investment in partnerships. However, and I love that you've articulated this distinction, is that the nature of each one of those, each individual partnership is still highly incremental. We've made a strategic investment in highly incremental partnerships, right? And I think I appreciate that distinction a lot. Sam, we're out of time for today's episode. It has been a pleasure to have you on. Before we go, what's going on with you right now? Is there anything you want to plug or present to our audience? And then the second part is, where can we find you? If our audience wants to connect with you more, follow up, how can they do that and where?
Yeah, for sure. Appreciate it. Like I said at the beginning of the chat, recently joined Retail Voodoo. We do consumables, brand strategy, insights, design, work like that. Most of what we do is transformational work. So really brands that are looking to redirect or pivot, brands that are looking to get into a whole new categories. We really focus on doing, I'll call it game-changing work, mostly for better for you brands. Folks can certainly find me on LinkedIn is the easiest way to find me, or you can just go to the Retail Voodoo website and you'll find me there. And I would always say, hey, reach out. We are fairly mission-centric consulting firm. So even if you are a smaller or emerging brand, don't presume that we're necessarily too expensive for you. From that standpoint, please do reach out. We want to influence consumables for the better, right? We view consumables as being something that can make everybody's life better every day, right?
Yep.
Because consumers touch these products so often, improving them, making them better for you, making them more natural or higher function or introducing new benefits is really something that can improve standards of living for everyone. And so I would say, please reach out if you're looking to do that. We have a great track record that you can see on the Retail Voodoo website. We're pretty easy to find from that standpoint. And the only other thing I would say is, follow me on LinkedIn. I do post a lot and I offer a lot of insights and things like that just to be of value to the community. And so if you're in CPG or marketing generally, follow me on LinkedIn and you can see the stuff that I'm putting out there.
Wonderful. And once again, I'm going to encourage everyone to follow. It's a fount of wisdom. But Sam, thank you once again for joining us. That's it for today. And we look forward to talking with you again soon.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Brett. Have a good one.
This has been another episode of the Brand Together podcast with your host, Brett Ryan. Join us again next week for another deep dive into brand partnerships. And remember to subscribe to the Brand Together podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, or anywhere else podcasts are found.